Welcome to the Property Voice Podcast, helping you to navigate safely through the world of property investing. Get the lowdown and updates, insights and outcomes on all matters property with a splash of entertainment along the way. The Property Voice, a voice to trust among the crowd. Now, let's get started with your host, Richard Brown.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Property Voice podcast. My name is Richard Brown. As always, it's a pleasure to have you join me on the show again today. So far in this series, our focus has been on the higher, or if you like, the macro level of the overall property cycle, as you may have gathered over the last few weeks. Now today we start to move a little bit closer to home and indeed look at our own personal property cycle, if you like. So it's not an individual property here, it's a collection in our own portfolio. So we're going to start to look at how the journey unfolds and changes over time with regard to our own property portfolio. And I'm joined on today's show by David Clouter, who started investing back in 1982. And he's seen a few property cycles and several property strategies over those decades in business as well. In fact, I think he may have even created or invented some of the strategies, as you'll hear from our interview. So who better to listen to and observe in the context of developing our own property portfolios than, I wonder? Now I'm going to share with you the interview with David as a precursor to a wider discussion on the property portfolio cycle subject and how this can develop over time in another episode. So let's hear my interview with David Clouter right now in Property Chatter.
Okay, so let's get on with this week's featured topic with Property Chatter.
Hi, I'm very pleased to have with me David Clouter, who's kindly agreed to join me on the show today. And David, first of all, welcome. How are you?
Thanks. Hello, Richard. Thanks for having me on today.
No, you're very welcome. I know we've had a few chats and engagements via various means, so it's I'm glad we got it together. Thanks again. I really appreciate that. But David, as you know, I mentioned to you that we try and have what we call subject matter experts, and I'm very pleased that you could agree to join us today. But to help in that regard, it'd be useful if you wouldn't mind sharing, particularly with the listeners, just a little bit about yourself, and obviously in particular about property investing, and a little bit about your story, just to set the scene a little, if you don't mind.
Yes, of course. I mean, I'm just a humble, what they call an accidental landlord. But the thing is, it started quite a long time ago. It was, the year was 1982, and I just started a new job in London, and I was renting a flat, and the people in the flat upstairs used to party until 4 a.m. And I used to have to get up at 7 o'clock to go to work. Simple as that. So when they moved out, I gave my landlord a ring. He was living in Spain at the time, in a town called Mojaca. So he was quite pleased when I proposed to him that I would find the next tenants, really, just to get a good night's sleep. So that was how it all began for me. And I ended up doing what I believe today is called rent-to-rent, but we called it subletting. And the rent that I was getting from the flat that was immediately above me, which I was managing, made a very significant contribution towards my living expenses in the flat below. And so that was my first step in the journey, and I was 23 years old then.
Wow. Okay. So, and I guess you've obviously seen quite a lot over those years, several decades now.
Well, as things worked out, I've had tenants continuously without a break since then. So I guess I must have been doing something right. A couple of years after that, a friend told me, there was a lot of peer pressure. You really must get on the property ladder. So I bought a little flat in Finsbury Park, actually, in North London. And the whole thing was going through. Because I was a newbie, I didn't know how long it took to buy a flat. The guy I was buying from was an expat working abroad, so he was in no hurry to move this forward. So it took about 6 months to buy this flat. Mm-hmm. During which time I was reflecting on the whole process, and this flat that I was buying was about half the size of the one that I was living in, almost for free with rent to rent. The kitchen was in the living room, so it was kind of a ghastly place really. And about 2 weeks before I was due to move in, after exchange of contracts, I rang up my bank and I said, "Help! What can I do? I hate the place." And they said, "We'll give you permission what's it called, permission to let, and so I paid them a small fee and put tenants in there as well. So before long, I had my second tenanted property, and and I rapidly discovered that the rents that I was being paid were covering the cost of ownership, and over time that one started appreciating.
So I have to pause you there, because it can't go without saying, an observation really, that, so let me just understand, in the early 80s you were effectively applying rent to rent and buy to let before the existence of formal buy to let mortgages, and certainly the marketing hype around rent to rent.
That's correct. Yes, I was some way ahead of the crowd there, I guess. But it's just sort of the thing that landed into my lap as things worked out.
And I guess if we fast forward, just give us an indication of really the just potted view really of experience and scale that you might have seen as an investor over the subsequent years.
Absolutely. I scaled up quite a lot in London, obviously, although it took me a while, but right all through the 1990s, property prices were completely flat in London, and I used that opportunity to buy HMOs, to buy one or two single lets, although that's never been my preferred thing, and small multi-lets and what today would be called HMOs, so I was doing them long before that definition came out as well, and all that continued, sort of chugged along for about 20 years, and then I decided to relocate. And so I moved the whole portfolio, lock, stock and barrel, up to Cambridge, where I am now, because I didn't want to give up too much of what I had. I didn't want to sort of have half as much property or half as much equity when I arrived as when I left. I spent some years flipping, which was another strategy that I got into, and that paid a lot of the tax to cover my move. And so I find myself here in Cambridge today at a different stage in my property journey with a totally different type of property.
Yeah, I think this is wonderful to hear you sort of elaborate on that. And I know we talked a little bit before we got into recording about our lifestyle and something. We'll come back to that, but just to sort of set the scene a little bit, we're in the middle of on my series about property cycles. And we covered the overall property cycle a couple of weeks ago, and we're going to look at individual property cycles, in terms of buying a single unit in the coming weeks. But right now, our focus is on, if you like, a property portfolio. So it's a bit like your journey from 1982 to today, and that's the context of what I wanted to talk to you about. And in fact, if we can just dive into that a little bit, how do you see portfolio cycle? Generally speaking, do you see clear stages, for example?
It does. I think that there's always a balance to be drawn, isn't there, between risk and reward, and in property just as much as everybody as any other field. That risk in property probably comes when we look at gearing. Interestingly enough, coming back to that first flat that I ever lived in, it had previously been owned by a sort of minor property magnate. There were two brothers who were opticians, and they started investing spare cash from the business into buying property at a time when property was quite cheap, because if you think back in those days, I think now I believe it takes about 8.5 years of the average salary to buy a property. In those days, it was about 2 or 3 months worth of salary would buy your property, and they built up an enormous portfolio across North London by what is called today, I believe, snowballing. I think there are some footballers. Doesn't Robbie Fowler do that as well? He sort of picks up houses for cash from time to time. And obviously, as that sort of portfolio grows, the actual cash flow from the business compounds and allows you to buy more and more property, so that you're not geared and you're not borrowing at all. So there are other ways. There's not just the one way to do it.
Yeah. So basically, this from nothing to having a vast empire, there'll be key stages you can go through, but equally there are different approaches you can take to do that, I guess is the takeaway there.
Yes, that's absolutely what I'm saying. That although sort of the overall game plan might be the same, the detail and particularly the way of getting started can vary considerably. And now, for example, one of the things that I stress to people sort of starting out, a lot of people tell you that you can start in property and after a couple of weeks or months or whatever, give up your day job. And that is certainly something that I would never, ever advocate, because one of the key principles that I work to is that the money, i.e. the rent or the capital appreciation or whatever it is, the money belongs to the property, and you should be kind of self-sustaining in the background from some other kind of activity.
That's interesting as well. I share that point of view. And is there a point in time where that can cross over and change? I guess, in the early stages.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. There's a risk, I guess, in the early stages that if you jump ship and try and live off the proceeds of the portfolio, that you're in a vulnerable position. But I guess at some point in time, there's a good argument that it can sustain itself, and you, in fact.
Oh, I think everybody makes the transition at some point, but I think that the danger is in making it too soon. I had a fellow who came up to have a coffee with me in Cambridge recently, and he'd been on some kind of course, as a result of which he gave up his job immediately. He hadn't really secured much at all, but on the basis of him sort of scrabbling about a bit, his partner was about to give up her job as well. I said, for goodness sake, stop, because one of the first things that people forget is that as soon as they give up the day job, not only are they very severely impacting the ability of their portfolio to compound, but at the same time, if they're doing this through borrowing, and I think most of us have to nowadays to get things started, suddenly 2/3 of the best products and all the best rates are suddenly no longer available to you.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what people often forget about is that in addition to funding our living costs and our lifestyle, which is why we would maybe take our income from a portfolio as opposed to, let's say, a job, the portfolio itself needs looking after. It needs further investment. It needs contingencies for repairs and upgrades. It needs deposits for other properties. So, people perhaps lose sight of that. You say, I need to replace X £1,000 a month as an income, and then they forget the other side of the equation. And you need to fill the hopper, don't you, constantly?
Absolutely so. And another thing that people forget is that on the whole, I think probably for almost everybody, while you're working in your 9 to 5 or whatever, you're not actually spending money on yourself during that period. But once you've developed a sort of independent income stream and your financial freedom and so forth, you might want to play golf at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So your expenditure on yourself might actually go up as well. So, I started, as I said, in 1982. I gave up my day job in 1995, so that was, 12, 13 years. Even then, I think maybe I rushed it a bit, because my portfolio would certainly be much bigger today if I'd stayed on just 3 or 4 more years and got a few more mortgages and a few more properties.
Yeah, I think it's ironic, because literally this morning I share a quote on a Monday. I call it Motivation Monday, and today I literally shared a quote from Warren Buffett, who was talking about he talked about having an additional income stream or income source. And a lot of people, they don't look at the merits of doing that. And I elaborated there may be several reasons why that's a good idea to have several sources of income. Most people concentrate, whether it's in a business or a job, most probably. And so the idea is to develop alternative income streams. It's very rare, though, that you can develop that alternative income stream sufficiently to replace the job and your lifestyle expenses. And as you say, they may increase. So it could take some time. To your point,
yes, that's true.
Yeah. Sorry,
that's true. And people do sort of. Some people get carried away a bit in all the sort of euphoria of it all. And certainly, I mean, my mentor, and he was sort of around working in the sort of 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and me personally, we've seen people who build their portfolios too quickly, possibly acting on bad advice. And then, I mean, there were certainly a lot of people kind of swaggering around in 2006 saying, hey, look at me, I've got 20 houses, I built them all in a year. And then, what happened was that sort of 4 or 5 years later, these fellas had lost a lot and weren't bragging anymore, because they hadn't understood that with the sort of upside, that there is the downside. There are the risks, and you have to plan for both.
Let's just dive into that a little bit, because people can get a bit carried away and then go, okay, I've now generated an income from this portfolio, whether it's for whatever means, let's say. But
yes.
How can it disappear? What are the sort of things that could happen? You've obviously seen a few cycles, a couple of cycles anyway.
Indeed. Indeed. Interestingly enough, let's come back to the start of my journey. So I bought this flat. That was in 1986, and it cost me £28,000. And at the time, the government were fiddling with things that were to do with tax relief, as governments are wont to do. And there was a thing called MIRAS, Mortgage Interest Relief at Source, which applied to two individuals could buy a house together, not necessarily a couple or related or anything, and both of them would get tax relief. And it was announced with a year's prior warning that this tax perk, or if that's what you want to call it, would be abolished from, I think it was the summer of 1989, but somebody can correct me if I've got the dates wrong. And there was a frantic scrabble to buy property, not to miss out on this deadline. So the flat that I'd paid 28 for in 1986, I was actually offered in the spring of 1989. I was offered £82,000 for this flat, a staggering increase in value. And as a total newbie, I thought, oh, well, that's what property always does. It goes up in price, I'll keep it. Once this government deadline had passed and the mortgage relief was no longer available to new buyers, everybody's interest in buying a house totally collapsed. Suddenly I saw about £30,000 wiped off the value of my new purchase. And I was very sort of disheartened by this, and I thought, what on earth shall I do? And I was about to follow the crowd, so I found a chap at work who was kind of prepared to buy this flat for me for a mere £50,000. That's £30,000 less than I had been offered in cash some months earlier, and we were proceeding. But he was one of these guys who would ask a lot of questions, like how many levers did you say is on the front door lock, and do all the windows open outwards, and all this kind of stuff. So after a few months of this, it was cash flowing positive. I had doubled my money anyway, so I thought, you know what, I'm going to keep it. And if I hadn't done that, if I'd got disheartened at that early stage, I might not be where I am today, because I might have just said, oh, I might have ended up as a sort of cabbie or something, saying, property governor, that doesn't work. So it's very important that, to factor in, and interest rates is a very important thing to factor in, because many people forget that for how many months is it now? Quite a long time, quite a few years, we've had a base rate that is at an historic all-time low. For 400 years, it hasn't been at 0.5%.
Yeah, was it 80 months consistently? I'm trying to think. I think I heard it the other day. It's a long time.
I think it is. So that is a heck of a long time. And the other thing that happened then at the beginning of the 1990s. So first of all, we lost that tax relief, which made everybody lose interest. And then there was this thing with George Soros betting against the pound and the exchange rate mechanism, and the interest rates shot up. So by contrast to a base rate of 0.5% today, 12, 13, 14 was normal. And I think for a couple of weeks it actually hit 16%. And I had to keep my modest at that point property portfolio intact with interest rates like that, and that's when the day job came very, very handy, because I was just doing every bit of overtime going, and to keep everything afloat, and trying to cut costs on the property as well, on the outgoings.
I'm really glad you shared this experience, because what it allows us to do is highlight a couple of points. Because I think with your first story with that flat, and having the cash offer and not taking it, and maybe being tempted through frustration or whatever to take a lower offer later, when the one key principle was house prices go down as well as up, and so
indeed,
and so you have this loss of asset value or loss of equity potential, or loss of profit in your case. That can eat into the situation. But a lot of people then go, don't worry about it, I've got the cash flow to cover the position. So you hedge against the asset price devaluation with cash flow, which is exactly what you did. But then lo and behold,
indeed, so
you then had high interest rates, which pushed up your costs, didn't they? And probably ate into your cash flow position. So I'm only saying it really just to highlight.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go on.
When I started out, sorry to interrupt you, when I started out, I was actually, for a short time, I was negatively geared. Now, that is something that normally only happens, it's quite normal. In Australia and New Zealand, it's par for the course that if you've got a property with tenants in it, it's going to cost you $100 a month or something, because people regard it as a pension. But here, everybody panics big time when that happens. So yes, for a while, I was subsidizing my tenants. Nice. For a short while.
Yes, yeah, because we talked about the property cycle and recessions, actually, funnily enough, just last week. And what happened in around about that time is, whilst interest rates went up, inflation, and in particular rents, went up as well, perhaps with a lag. but they went up, so it allow you to some extent to play a little bit of catch up. So it's a slight.
Yes, there was, but
go ahead.
There was, as you say, a lag, and so, as I say, it was just for a short time, but for a short time I was really questioning as to whether property was really for me and whether I'd really done the right thing.
Yeah, so I guess your takeaway was, if I just paraphrase, try and develop the portfolio, which is adding assets, presumably cash flowing assets. You did talk about negative gearing, but I presume you'd recommend cash flowing assets. And
I would.
Okay, and then but try and sustain your main source of income, whether that's your job, which is probably most people, or maybe if you're
Mm-hmm.
self-employed or something like that, where your sort of bread and butter comes in. Yeah, okay, and then and
at that point. Sorry, at that point, I didn't have any money as such to invest in it. So what I did, I kind of, early on, I made a lot of the right decisions. I had this 2-bedroom flat in London. I built myself a stud partition. I made it into a 3-bedroom flat, and that improved my cash flow, and that's what saved me at the end of the day.
There's another strategy that you've just shared as well, isn't it? So
well.
You were doing all of these things before they were invented, or maybe you're the one who invented them, David. I don't know, but
who knows?
It's fascinating. But so just going to the principle of a portfolio and a cycle of a portfolio. I guess if we talk about, you've got startup and you've got exit, and you've got a couple of steps in between. What are the key steps that you see, and what can people do to prepare themselves as they go through looking at portfolio development?
Right, I think you've got to start with a plan, haven't you, really? So you can't sort of muddle through it as I did. If I had a plan when I started out, instead of sort of learning it all as I went along and making it up, no doubt I would be sort of further down the line than I am today. And but I think nowadays we can benefit from the fact that there are a lot of people who've kind of been there and done that. So when people come along to me for mentoring, and we always start by, I ask them, where are you at the moment? What's your attitude to risk? Where would you like to be in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? And then we try and work out a way to get there. And I think that's everybody's journey. It's personal to you. Take on board all the pertinent facts that, such as the way that the property market is cyclical, and so you're not going to be surprised when these things inevitably happen, and you know sort of what signs to look for. But then say, how can I turn what I know, how can I use this knowledge to my advantage to fuel growth? And a simple example of that would be to wait until the property market tanks, having built up some money, and then spend that money buying properties when nobody else has any money, for example.
Mm-hmm. And what about... So, go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted.
Sorry, no, do continue.
No, I was going to say, and what about, so once you've made the plan and you've made a start, how do things unfold or develop, and are the different characteristics? For example, access to cash and borrowing and these sorts of things.
Yes, these are things that you've got to manage very, very carefully. It does depend on your attitude to risk, and it does depend on the speed at which you want to grow. I tend to grow quite modestly. I'm not in any sort of rush to do things. There's another strategy that we could talk about, which is pound cost averaging. And this is often seen in the world of equities, but it can be seen in building a portfolio as well. So that, for example, if I were to buy a house a year, then it wouldn't matter too much if there's sort of cyclical movement, because at the end of 10 or 15 years, I would have ended up with 15 properties which I had acquired at the average price, not too expensive, not too cheap. By riding these cycles a bit and by being aware of what's going on around you, you can achieve better value. But it's hard unless you do something really foolish to lose a lot of money in property. But the really foolish thing would be to borrow too much too quickly.
Yeah, wise words. And we talked a little bit, didn't we, about the portfolio development or the portfolio cycle, which this is what all about, can vary depending on the individual and where they are in life. And I was very interested in what your thoughts were there. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, because there doesn't necessarily have to be an exit strategy. There might be a sort of succession strategy of passing the portfolio on to your heirs. But to take my mentor as an example, he was a penniless refugee who didn't speak any English, and he arrived with his mother, aged about 6 or 7 or 8, I think, so he went through the sort of educational system, became an estate agent, very rapidly found that he was very good at it, started his own agency, ended up at about 35, potentially financially independent, with about, I think he had about 15 cash flowing units. Said to his wife, do you mind if we take this a bit further? She said, no, sure, you seem to know what you're doing. So he pledged his entire portfolio as security for his first residential development, and worked very hard. He was working the phones to find the tenants. He had the money was coming in tranches from the banks, and he ended up a property billionaire. And right into his 90s, he was still doing a lot of it hands-on himself, because that was kind of his life. It got his energy going. Some people might decide to sort of downsize a bit or to run it down, but others, and I think I'm someone who will stay in the saddle right till the bitter end.
Yeah, and when you talked about people you engage with, is there a difference potentially between someone, let's say, in their 20s to someone in, say, their 50s, potentially?
Oh, very much so. In the same way that if you're in some kind of employment, early on in the job, you're the guy running around fetching the coffee and doing all the sort of legwork. But as you later on in life, you sort of take it easy and you take a sort of nominal role like head of pencil sharpeners or something, and somebody else is running around. So in property, what that might mean, for example, is that in your 20s and 30s you have quite a high level of gearing, although perhaps not so high now in the light of the summer budget as I would have advised a year or two ago. But then when you get to, say, your mid-50s or something, or when you get to your mid-40s, you might start to gear down a bit in the same way that people prepare for retirement, so that you have a largely unencumbered portfolio to retire on with a steady, I won't say passive income, because it isn't, it's a misconception, but a steady sort of lowish maintenance income coming in for the rest of your days.
Yeah, so it's something about, you talked about attitude to risk, but it's also appetite for risk, isn't there? Because I guess if you're single in your 20s, say, you don't have maybe a partner, you don't have children to worry about, that can have an influence on your appetite for risk, as well as maybe your attitude to risk. Whereas that could be quite different as you get to 40, 30, 40, 50, depending on what happens in your life, obviously.
That's a very, very good point, Richard. And we spent most of the session talking about my attitude to risk and my portfolio growth and my strategy. Could I sort of interject for a moment, and could I ask about yours?
Yeah, well, in terms of how things developed and my own attitude.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I started a little bit like you, insofar as it was accidental. In the mid-90s, I had a home, but I had a promotion at work which was several hundred miles away. And so, instead of selling, we decided to rent the place out, and it was, pure accidental landlord status. So that was my first investment. As I say, pretty much an accident. Didn't know what I was doing. Fairly little in the way of regulation, etc. And I appointed a letting agent. I managed to get a tenant in who told me they were going to stay for a long time. And within a few months, I'd had a major repair issue which wiped out a whole year's profit. And then after 6 months of this long-term tenancy, the tenant served notice. I thought, blimey, this is a bit difficult.
Oh my.
So I sold that property, and that's if ever I want to beat myself up, I just look at the value of that property today. So that was a big lesson for me in retrospect. At the time, I made a few quid. Can't really tell you what I did with it, but I didn't reinvest it into property for a while. So that was my sort of start. But in earnest, when I got going properly, it wasn't that long ago. It was only about 6-8 years ago, and I didn't have a lot of money. I knew I had a plan, to your point, but I didn't have a lot of money, and so my strategy became one of recycling my cash, making my money work hard for me. And so it was all value-adding strategies. Buy, do up, refinance, or sell on was predominantly what I did. So I had a family at that stage, so I couldn't take too many risks. To your point about attitude to risk and maybe appetite for risk, I've always been something of a risk taker, but I had responsibilities as well. So that's another reason why I didn't just sort of throw everything, all caution to the wind. But I was very much on the sideline developing my portfolio, again, like you, before I was in a position to say, well, this could sustain me if I wanted it to. But I do believe in this idea of having multiple income sources. So property rental income is just one. And so I have other streams of income. So I want to hedge a little bit with having multiple streams, because you don't know what can happen. So, here I am, I'm in the late 40s, and, I have a portfolio, reasonable sized portfolio. It can sustain me. I picked up a phrase actually from someone who I worked with, who used the term he said employment optional. There we go. So, employment optional. I have a flexible lifestyle. I travel a bit, and I'm able to run my portfolio from anywhere in the world. So that's just a little bit about me. But I've given you a few clues to what you're saying about stages in life and attitude to risk and access to funding and these sorts of things that we've been talking about.
Yes. So although our specific portfolios, our specific journeys have kind of been different, there's a sort of broad takeaway here in that what property can do for everybody and what is attainable.
Yeah, and thanks for asking me the question. I really appreciate that. It allows us, as you say, to illuminate a couple of different approaches. But I guess at this stage, what drawing a bit of a close, there's probably just a couple of questions I wanted to pose to you, David, and get your take. Have you any specific tips for either new or aspiring investors, or potentially someone who's just looking for a change of direction? Anything you would?
So that's interesting, because there is no one size fits all. That's the first thing I'd say. So somebody who wants to start out in property might have no money at all. They might have 50,000 they want to put in. They might have 200,000. So obviously there'd be different advice in those circumstances. They might be somebody who's very, very, very risk averse, and who is some sort of plodding through their sort of career path in which they see property as just a bit of a top up, or there might be someone who's very dissatisfied with where they're at the moment, in which case I would say don't, as a result of that dissatisfaction, do anything too risky or too soon. So I'd say, have a look at the landscape, take a look around, see what other people are doing, talk to people, engage, and get their help, because there are at least, aren't there, 2 million landlords. So the chances are the person sitting next to you on the train tomorrow morning may well be a property investor. Strike up a conversation and benefit from their experiences.
Very good. I think it can be a lonely old trail, can't it? So tap into the experience and the wisdom of people around you. But another phrase does come to mind is free advice could also be the most costly you ever take.
Oh, very, very much so. Before following anybody's advice at all, particularly the bloke down the pub, see where they're at, and only surround yourself with the positive can-do people, and only take advice from them. The naysayers will just drag you down to their level. Yeah.
And I have to steal a little bit. I've been talking about property cycles generally, and I know you have some views on it. But any sort of quick insight as to where you think we are generally and what we can expect over coming years? I'm taking a liberty here and asking you this question because it's a little bit off the topic, but it's in the general theme.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. As you may know, I've got a whole 1 hour's talk where I talk about property cycles. Unfortunately, that's got more than 150 slides, and I'm a chap with a terrible memory, and the slides are like my sort of reminders. So as the slide flashes up, I go, oh yeah, the world's tallest building, or whatever. But have a look around, see how many people, see how many full-page adverts there are in one of these sort of London magazines like Metro for property courses, instant ones, free ones for 3 hours or something, from people you've never heard of. Look around. I was up in the Financial Times building with the editor Andrew Hill a week or two back, and we were counting on the skyline the number of tower cranes that we could see. That's another sort of indicator. So see if you feel, for example, that the market's getting a bit overheated, and then make your plans accordingly.
And do you feel it's getting a little bit overheated at the moment?
I think that's for the listener to decide, don't you?
Okay, you're not getting off that fence. So I'm intrigued, and the listeners might be as well. You talked about, in fact, a talk with 100-odd slides on cycles, and it's quite clear that you've got lots of experience, both in terms of time, but also depth, really, in terms of what you've covered. Can we point people how to maybe get in touch if they wanted to? Where's the best place to get hold of you?
Yes, I suppose one place they can find me, which is quite an obvious sort of place, is on facebook.com/David.Clouter, because I seem to be on there far more than I should.
I've seen you very active in the property community, David, so I'm sure people can find you.
So that's great.
What I'll do is I'll drop the links in the show notes as well. So if anybody wants to look you up and you couldn't remember that, no worries. I'll just put the links in the show notes for today's show. But I think, in terms of today, I really appreciate your insights and your wisdom. It's always good to have you and someone with your experience on the show, David. So thank you once again for joining. And probably just in parting, is there anything I should have asked you that I haven't? Or did we cover it?
No, I think we've covered it very comprehensively, Richard, and thank you very much for having me on. Much appreciated.
You're more than welcome, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Thanks, David. So I really do hope the points came over clearly there. David has been investing in property since 1982 and has seen, if not even pioneered, many of the different property strategies which we know today under different names and guises in the 30 plus years that he has been investing. Now he talks about how our property portfolio will evolve and develop over time, how it will or could change with our life circumstances and indeed our risk appetite, and not to mention our access to funding. Now he made the point that we should have a plan and that this should be personal to us and our very own situation. And finally, he was also cautioning us against the downsides and against rushing too quickly into the quit your job mentality without having a rock solid foundation underneath us. Now I wanted to introduce the idea of portfolio cycles in this episode by sharing some of the wisdom of somebody that has been operating for several years, 30 odd years actually. So, he's a good person to listen to, and I think David's perfect for, sharing his wisdom over that period of time. And we'll return to the topic in a little more detail next time around. However, one thing that David did mention to me after the interview itself, and I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this, was his desire for people to have both all of the information possible, but equally to think and decide for themselves. And he's therefore something, I guess, in my words, my description of an anti-guru, you could say. And despite David's clear modesty in not really wishing to present himself as some sort of know-it-all or guru rather, I can assure you that he knows his stuff intellectually, instinctively, and also practically. And that makes him well worth listening to, in my opinion. So thanks once again, David, if you are listening. I really appreciate your inputs today. Now, he really wasn't joking when he said he spends a lot of time on Facebook, and I don't think he means playing, the games, etc. that you find on Facebook. He's very active in the property communities. I'm sure you'll see his name. It's not the most common name, so you'll probably see it stand out. So do as he suggested and look to connect with him on Facebook. And as he mentioned, his Facebook account is facebook.com/David.Clouter. And he spells his name Clouter. I guess you could spell David, so that's why I didn't spell that. Okay, so let's move on to Your Voice then.
Up next is Your Voice. It's all about you and your property world.
Okay, so back to Your Voice then, and we have another 5-star review this week, and this time it comes from Anch, who says, invaluable free resource, and I think that's a point he wishes to emphasize. Yet another great resource from the Property Voice. What with the blog and the Investor Toolkit, you have access to all the knowledge you need to start or improve your property journey within property investing. I have found the podcast to date to be very informative and interesting. I'm not a big fan of Kazza, not another one, but I think I'm in the minority there. The podcast is definitely worth a listen for anyone looking to start out in property. There are so many people out there trying to sell this information to you. Why not get it for free from the Property Voice? Well, thank you very much, Anch, and for the kind words and obviously the call-outs to some of the other resources that we share. So much appreciate that. Not really feeling a lot of love for Kazza, are we? A couple of weeks running. I think she might be on an extended sabbatical after all of this. So Kazza bashing aside, we really do appreciate the reviews that you send in to us though, so please take a moment if you would and leave us a review on iTunes. It really does help spread the word, and of course I can get to call out your name on this segment of the show as well. But right now, it's the shout out.
And now, where you can go for more great resources with the shout out.
In today's shout out, I wanted to share a piece of technology which might be familiar to you already, but I almost take for granted, but really I should not. It's called WhatsApp. It's, you probably all know it as a very cool and indeed free SMS or text service, which is great in itself. However, in addition to text, we can also send voice messages or voice memos. We can send images and videos as well. Again, all free of charge. Of course, this is outside of any network data charges, that is, so it's especially effective when you're using Wi-Fi, or if you've got inclusive data in your mobile phone plan. And yet it recently got even better, and we can now use WhatsApp to make and receive telephone calls as well. Yes, telephone calls. And this makes it a real crossover between Viber and Skype, I think. And it really comes into its own if you've got a limited number of text or minutes in your mobile call plan, and especially, as I mentioned, when you're using Wi-Fi. And it's great when you're traveling overseas because you can have low-cost international telephone calls, in fact, now, again, once you're using Wi-Fi. So on a practical level, I've been using WhatsApp to connect with tenants, with agents, contractors and other service providers by message and call, either individually or indeed in groups, because you can have group chat as well. And I've sent and received video messages, images of properties to consider buying, as well as on-site repairs and maintenance to authorise and close off works. It even tells you if a message has been delivered and read, which is pretty useful to confirm whether your message is getting through or not. What's up with WhatsApp then? Not much really, I'd say. I think it's pretty cool. So if you haven't got it already, or indeed if you haven't explored all of the features of WhatsApp, then I would suggest you do. And nothing in it for me, just a big shout out for a good piece of technology. But there we have it, another week of property content to feed our hunger of knowledge in property. By all means, feel free to drop me an email personally, podcast@thepropertyvoice.net, and as always, the show notes will be over at the website thepropertyvoice.net. But thank you very much for listening once again this week, and until next time on the Property Voice podcast, it's ciao ciao.
Thank you for listening today. Now head over to thepropertyvoice.net for more inspirational content and get updates through our mailing list. Join us next time on the Property Voice podcast. And if you enjoyed the show, please don't forget to rate us on iTunes.